Ambassador Nathan Sales, thank you so much for joining me on this special edition of America Unfiltered here in Washington, D.C. on location. Ambassador Sales, when you and I served in the State Department, you were our leading expert on counterterrorism, and today we find ourselves hearing some breaking news about the U.S. FBI foiling a terrorist plot in Los Angeles. This weekend we saw the tragic events, a terror attack in Bondi Beach, Australia. Can you tell us your assessment of global terrorism right now?
Well, Ellie, it's great to be with you and really appreciate you having me on the show. I think this weekend was a wake-up call that terrorism still matters. We're living in an era where countries like China and Russia and Venezuela are really dominating the headlines when it comes to global crises and foreign policy. But we can't take our eye off the ball. Terrorism is still very much a threat. Plots here in the United States, deadly attacks in Australia, killing 15 people. In addition, we saw reporting from Europe that authorities in Germany disrupted a plot to attack a Christmas market, plot by 5 people. Apparently they were going to drive a car into crowds of people. It seems like there's been a steady drumbeat of reminders that terrorism is still a problem and that no matter how much we want to turn the page on the 9/11 era and move on to other national security priorities, we can't afford to take the risk because no matter what our intentions are, the terrorists still intend to target us and kill us. So we've got to keep our eye on the ball.
So terrorism is still a big problem, according to your assessment. What would you like to see the U.S. government and other governments, our partners, our allies, do about it?
Well, the most important thing is, first, just to recognize that it's still a priority. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of terrorism that's been targeting Jewish people. We often hear, well, it couldn't happen here. 15 Jews gunned down celebrating Hanukkah on Bondi Beach. Well, that's in Australia. It couldn't happen here. It's happening here. It has happened here. Here in Washington, not that far from where we're sitting right now, 2 employees of the Israeli embassy were gunned down at an event not too many months ago. And we also saw in Colorado, in Boulder, Colorado, an arson attack against a number of peaceful protesters who are calling for the return of hostages held by Hamas in Gaza. And so anti-Semitism is not an over there problem. It's a here problem as well. The first thing we need to do is confront this ageless, timeless evil that is still on the march today. And it's very easy to condemn acts of violence. We stand with the Jewish community. It's going to take more than just condemning acts of violence. We also have to condemn the hateful ideology, the anti-Semitic ideology that incubates and nurtures these acts of violence, these acts of terrorism. We have to confront the ideas. And that doesn't mean censorship. That doesn't mean the government locking people up. That's what they do in Europe. They put people in jail for mean tweets. That's not the American way. The American way is counter speech. More protesters out in the streets demonstrating in support of our peaceful Jewish neighbors. More statements by government officials saying that anti-Semitism is unacceptable and we're not going to accept it here.
Well, I'm so grateful to you for your leadership and for bringing this topic up specifically about the anti-Semitism we're witnessing and the rise of it. If I may, you just said that protest is good, but some of the criticism of the previous Biden administration was that they allowed the pro-Hamas protesters to kind of run wild and that it was moving towards violence and that perhaps even this plot that the FBI foiled today, that perhaps that is somehow linked to this pro-Hamas movement. What is your take on that? How do we define boundaries?
So I'm a free speech absolutist. I don't believe the government has any role in telling us what to think and in telling us what we can say. And as a conservative, I'm particularly worried about preserving a realm of ideas and speech away from government interference, because we've seen what can happen when governments weaponize anti-speech agendas. Conservatives have a lot to lose from governments that have the power to suppress speech, as we're seeing in Europe right now. Vice President Vance has spoken very powerfully about the threat to free speech that conservatives in particular face. But there's a difference between speech and violence and incitement to violence. Just 2 days, we're speaking of Australia and the attack in Australia, just 2 days after the October 7th attacks in Israel, On October 9th, 2023, a group of protesters, pro-Hamas protesters, were on the steps of the iconic Sydney Opera House. They weren't chanting peace, they weren't chanting peaceful coexistence, they were chanting "Gas the Jews." That is not an acceptable form of speech. Now, that doesn't mean the government should put those people in jail for it, as abhorrent as that speech is. What we should be doing is relying on people of goodwill to be out there on the streets, denouncing them as loudly as possible, talking about religious pluralism, talking about tolerance, talking about nonviolence. We've also seen in the United States that speech sometimes crosses over into conduct that is restrictive of people's freedom of movement and people's civil rights. On countless university campuses, we saw pro-Hamas encampments where Jewish students were physically blocked from going to class, where custodians were caught in buildings that were taken over by protesters. The minute your exercise of speech interferes with somebody else's rights, their ability to move, their ability to leave a building, their ability to not be held prisoner, the minute your speech turns into conduct that restricts other people's rights, the government has a legitimate role in making sure that it's opening the commons to all and preventing the exercise of what looks like speech turning over into restriction of other people's freedom.
Just to finish up on the Bondi Beach terror attack, the Israeli government has, I've seen some reports that they're making statements about a possible connection to the Islamic Republic of Iran. What is your take on that? Is there a role that the Iranian regime has played, or possibly?
It's hard to say. This sort of thing is certainly within the realm of possibility when you talk about the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic has committed terror attacks against Jews and Israeli embassy outposts and Jewish community centers all around the world, including in places like Bulgaria, including in places like Argentina. Not necessarily the first places you would think of as areas of active Iran-backed terror, but so they are. So it's possible. We're also seeing some reporting that the father and son terrorist, and that's who it was a father and his son, may have been sympathetic to ISIS. If that's the case, if they were associated with Sunni jihadism, it's probably not the case that the Islamic Republic was behind it. But time will tell. I think this is one of the things that investigators need to look very, very closely at.
Indeed, again, it's been a very tragic few days. I'd love to move us now to the United States National Security Strategy. Just came out recently. There was a lot of headlines that came out of it, but some of the leading headlines were regarding what the U.S. under the Trump administration sees the American role in our own hemisphere. What are you seeing about that, and what's interesting to you?
I think the top line from the national security strategy is that the United States is back in a big way in the Western Hemisphere. For too long, we've sort of had Western Hemisphere diplomacy on autopilot, just hope for the best while we pay attention to crises in Europe or in the Middle East or in the Indo-Pacific. But that period of strategic drift and inattention has really allowed some of the world's worst enemies of the United States to establish toeholds here in the Western Hemisphere. China has now become a very active economic player in the Western Hemisphere, and they trade with a lot of countries in the region. They're eyeing the Panama Canal. Meanwhile, in Venezuela, the Islamic Republic of Iran has very close ties with Venezuela, as does Russia and other American adversaries. So we can't afford to take the Western Hemisphere for granted. We need to make sure that we're trading with other countries here, that we have security arrangements with the other countries in our hemisphere, and that we are the partner of choice. There's lots of ways to go about this: economic, security, military, tech. All these different forms of cooperation are tools that we can use to strengthen our relationships in the Western Hemisphere. But the most important thing is simply showing up. We can't afford to look the other way and allow our adversaries to make inroads in the Western Hemisphere where we're simply hoping for the best.
And what's interesting is that for the first time, I heard U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, when he was asked about what's happening in with the United States and Venezuela specifically, he spoke about Hezbollah. And that's a subject that I know you've spent much of your career working on. It was kind of interesting to hear the Secretary of State mention that word and talk about the Iranian presence in Venezuela, because we don't hear that out of Washington often. Could you tell us a little bit about your work on the designation of Hezbollah as a terror organization in the Western Hemisphere, and how it links back to Trump administration policies?
So Hezbollah is really a global threat. It's a terror group that's based in Lebanon, but its activity is not limited to Lebanon. It's active here in the Western Hemisphere. And we've seen deadly terror attacks by Hezbollah operatives in places like Buenos Aires, an attack on the Israeli embassy back in the 1990s, an attack on the Arabiya Jewish Community Center back in the 1990s. And it's not just attack planning in the Western Hemisphere. We also know that Hezbollah sees the Western Hemisphere as a ripe area for fundraising. So in the tri-border region of Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay, there's a lot of Hezbollah activity related to casinos, related to trafficking, related to money laundering, and so on. And so one of the major priorities during the first Trump administration was working with our partners in the hemisphere to collectively address this threat, whether it's the threat of Hezbollah attacks or the threat of Hezbollah financing. And so we worked with a number of countries like Argentina, like Colombia, many others, to designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization under those countries' domestic legal authorities.
And you were quite successful, I remember that.
Well, it's a team effort. Diplomacy is a team sport. So we had a lot of people prioritizing this in the U.S. government, and we found willing partners in our hemispheric neighbors.
So how does that tie in now with Venezuela and the activity we're seeing? A lot of U.S. assets being moved near Venezuela, and what do you expect to happen next?
It's a really good question. I don't think we know yet, and frankly, I don't think President Trump has made up his mind yet on what he's going to do with Venezuela. There's no question that under Maduro, Venezuela is a cancer in the Western Hemisphere. Maduro and his socialist policies have managed to take what was once one of the most prosperous countries in the Western Hemisphere and run it into the ground. This is a textbook example of what happens when socialists take control of governments. They crash the economies, they partner with American adversaries, and they create a humanitarian crisis with thousands, if not millions, of people fleeing for better lives in countries that respect the rule of law and property rights. So what is President Trump going to do about it? I don't think we know yet. We've heard reports that the administration is in talks with the Maduro regime about Maduro leaving power. Obviously, that would be preferable to some of the more kinetic options, which put American troops at risk and which could cause unnecessary loss of innocent life in Venezuela. But I think Maduro is seeing what we're all seeing, that the military presence in the Caribbean, the increased presence of U.S. military assets just off his shores, it means we're not fooling around. I think Maduro needs to realize that his time is up and that he can go peacefully or he can go under different circumstances, and it would be better for everyone for him to go peacefully.
Okay, but you do think there's a possibility that we could move into kinetic action, that President Trump might make that decision at some point if Maduro doesn't want to go peacefully?
I don't think we know just yet. I think we know that President Trump rightly regards Maduro as a major problem in the Western Hemisphere and wants to see him gone. We also know that President Trump doesn't want to start regime change wars. We've learned the lesson the hard way from Iraq, from Afghanistan, that America's military is unsurpassed and we can dispatch any threat that we face. But the hard part comes after the guns go silent. The hard part is replacing the old regime with something new. So I think the president is probably looking at a number of different scenarios resulting in Maduro leaving power, including a military option, but it's not clear to me that he's going to, if you will, pull the trigger.
Is the Trump thinking on the EU, what's the relationship we're looking to have with them?
So I think we need to disentangle a couple of things here. One is NATO as a defensive alliance involving many European countries. Another is the EU, the regulatory superstate in Brussels. And a third piece here is the individual members of the EU, some of which enjoy very close relationships with the Trump administration, some of which have more strained relationships. So I think when the Trump administration looks at Europe, what it sees is incredibly prosperous countries that are regulating their economies and stifling innovation on the one hand, and that are much too willing to look to the United States to provide security for them. I think one of the most significant accomplishments that we've seen from President Trump's second term is NATO allies agreeing to spend 5% of their GDP on defense and defense-related infrastructure. It had been a 2% target, and a number of countries, as you know, struggled even to hit 2%. Now we've raised the bar up to 5%, and that should be the case. Prosperous, wealthy countries like Spain, like Italy, like Germany, like France, they should not be free riding on the American security guarantee. And so, there was a lot of hand-wringing in response to the national security strategy. President Trump hates Europe. He doesn't care about allies. I think that's exactly wrong. He cares about Europe so much that he wants them to step up and defend themselves and to spend the money necessary to defend themselves. And he values allies so much that he wants allies not just in name, but in reality, allies that can actually contribute something to the shared mission. And if you're only spending 1% of your GDP on defense, looking at you, Spain, if you're only spending pennies on the dollar, can the United States really count on you to fulfill your commitments as an ally? So understandably, some in Europe are still wringing their hands about the strategy. But if you read between the lines, what I see is a commitment to the NATO alliance enhanced by the 5% GDP target, and a call on our European allies to be worthy of the name ally and do as much as possible to collectively defend ourselves.
I want to drill down on NATO then, and I really appreciated the way you teased out NATO, EU, and our particular European allies. There seems to be some concern that maybe the United States would not hold up to Article 5 of the NATO alliance. Do you think that that's a legitimate concern for the Europeans?
I don't think so, because I think President Trump has made clear that, yes, the United States will honor our Article 5 commitments. He's said that a number of times. And I think, the Europeans can help themselves as well by demonstrating their commitment to the alliance. Before we get to Article 5, we have earlier parts of the NATO treaty which provide that all members shall promote the collective self-defense. You can't do that unless you have a military, and you can't have a military unless you spend money. So I think these things are not, these goals, these missions that are spelled out in the NATO treaty, they all complement one another. Right? In order to have a meaningful security guarantee under Article 5, you have to honor your prior commitments to actually establish the militaries that are capable of repelling a Russian invasion. So, I think President Trump has publicly endorsed Article 5, as he should, but I think it's not just enough to endorse Article 5. You also have to have an alliance with real capabilities, with real resources behind it that can execute a military mission if necessary. But the point is, we don't want it to be necessary. We want our military edge to be so overwhelming that the Russians never even try. Right? The Russians have gotten so badly bogged down in Ukraine, taking territory at the rate of inches per week. They are not going to be eager to fight with a NATO that is armed and bristling with the best possible military capabilities. So if you want to prevent war, it's peace through strength. And strength means investing in your own military capabilities.
So true, and I think that has been very much the Trump doctrine has been peace through strength, especially in this second administration. You mentioned Russia, Ukraine, so I want to ask you one question on that. It seems that the talks right now are stalled, perhaps, on territory, as you mentioned, sanctions relief, Where do you think the talks stand right now, and what would you expect to be the timeline?
It's really hard to say. It seems like the Ukrainians are prepared to make some tough concessions in order to bring this war to an end. They've said yes to basically everything President Trump has proposed. Ceasefire, the Ukrainians said yes. The Russians said no. Ending the war, the Ukrainians have said, we're ready to do it. The Russians, they want to drag out the fighting. So I think the solution to this impasse that we seem to be facing is to apply pressure to the party that is responsible for the impasse. And it's not the Ukrainians, it's the Russians. Vladimir Putin is continuing to fight because he thinks he can win on the battlefield. He doesn't want peace. He wants an empire. And so I think the way to get him to the negotiating table, to have real conversations, is to make the war painful for him. That means sanctions on Russian energy, and the Trump administration, to its great credit, finally announced sanctions on Russian energy exports that the Biden administration could have done and should have done years ago, but were afraid of angering Putin or destabilizing the relationship with Moscow. Trump has shown that he's prepared to apply real pressure to the Russians at the same time that he's telling the Ukrainians it's time to bring this to a close. And the other thing we need to do is ensure that Ukraine has the ability to defend its territory, selling it weapons. That doesn't mean charity. Under this administration, we've moved from a model in which the United States provides support to the Ukrainians to one in which the United States sells weapons that end up on the front lines in Ukraine. And that's not that unusual of a model. This is how the United States handles arms supplies to some of our closest allies. Israel doesn't get weapons for free. The Philippines don't get weapons for free. And so it's inevitable that we would move Ukraine from a model where arms are being provided in a crisis to a more sustainable model. But we need to continue that because as long as Putin continues to attack maternity hospitals and kindergartens in Ukraine and bomb civilians, Ukraine is going to need Patriot missile interceptors, and they're going to need long-range capabilities, Tomahawk cruise missiles or other long-range weapons that can take the fight to Russia and hit military targets that Russia is using to apply terror to innocent Ukrainian civilians.
Yeah, it's definitely heartbreaking to see this war. It seems very unending, and the president has said over and over again that he wants to see the killing stopped. So hopefully we will be getting there soon. With the few minutes we have left, I'd love to pivot to the Indo-Pacific. When it comes to China and the Trump policy in this second term, we're seeing perhaps a combination of an economic policy and a national security policy. And maybe some people are wondering if there's almost a softening of the Trump stance towards China. Do you think that's accurate?
It's hard to say right now. Remember, the first term went through different phases in the Trump administration's approach to China, starting off with attempting to draw China into a trade deal. But then when it became clear that Xi Jinping did what he always does, and that is to say lie and break his word, you saw some frustration in the White House, and you saw the administration pivot to a more combative approach to China with new trade measures being adopted, sanctions measures being adopted, and so on. Where are we right now? Well, it looks like the administration is, again, trying to coax China into a beneficial trade deal that would assist American manufacturers, American farmers, and so on. I would just say let's learn our lesson from history. President Xi, General Secretary Xi, has said, well, we'll take some steps to stop fentanyl poison from coming into your country, and maybe we'll buy a couple container ships full of soybeans. Let's see if he actually delivers. Talk is cheap. As we've seen from China, Xi Jinping has made a number of commitments to the United States that are easy to write down on paper but not always implemented. If, as has been true in the past, that the promises are not implemented in practice, I would look to see the White House pivot very quickly to the sort of confrontational, more combative approach that really characterized the last half of the first term. That really is one of President Trump's most important legacies. For decades, the foreign policy consensus in Washington on both sides of the aisle was we need to engage China, we need to trade with them. Forget about the theft of intellectual property, forget about currency manipulation, forget about trade imbalances. Let's trade with China, and that policy of engagement is going to bring China into the modern world where they will become, a prosperous liberal democracy and a friend of the United States. It didn't work, and President Trump was one of the first people to realize that that model was a complete failure. So it would be unusual for Trump to forget the lesson that brought him to power during the first term and that he implemented during the first term. So let's watch this space and see what happens.
Okay, I have one last question for you on China. In the national security strategy, there's a language on Taiwan which has garnered a lot of attention. It says in regard to the Taiwan Strait, the U.S., quote, does not support any unilateral change. What do you read that to mean?
So that's been the U.S. policy on China and Taiwan, more or less, for the past 50 years. Preserve the status quo. China says that Taiwan is part of its territory. Taiwan doesn't see it the same way, obviously. So no unilateral changes. That means we would not support Taiwan declaring independence. And we certainly would take a dim view of China trying to change the status quo by mounting an invasion across the strait. So I think the U.S. policy on Taiwan has traditionally been trying to straddle a chasm between the People's Republic of China on the one hand and the Republic of China on the other, not perfectly satisfying either side. It seems like we're trying to maintain that balance right now and neither give Taiwan encouragement to do something rash and break off from mainland China, and certainly not giving ammunition to the Chinese Communist Party to do something even more rash and irresponsible and threaten Taiwan by force.
So you do see it as somewhat of a warning to the Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party. Don't change the status quo. Don't go there.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's been a long-standing U.S. policy across many different administrations, including ones that don't agree with each other on much. It would be catastrophic for the world, for the United States, for our leadership in the Indo-Pacific, for Xi Jinping to authorize an invasion of Taiwan. And he said, People's Liberation Army needs to be ready to go by 2027. That's just about a year away, a little more than a year away right now. The way to stop that is deterrence. We need to be credibly signaling to the Chinese Communist Party that the cost they would have to pay for launching an invasion of Taiwan would be catastrophic. A military cost, an economic cost, the cost to their economy, the cost to their ability to trade with countries around the world. We want them to conclude that the game is simply not worth the candle. Leave well enough alone.
All right. Well, I hope that the CCP does heed that call. I am so grateful to you for this interview, a special edition live in person in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Nathan Sales, thanks so much for joining me on America Unfiltered.
Thanks, Ellie. Always a pleasure.